series that we're calling Counter Formation, and we started the series last week just exploring this idea that every single human being, whether you know it or not, whether you acknowledge it or not, are in a formation process. And we looked at a couple of verses as we launched the series last week, and one was found in Proverbs chapter 16, which says there's a way that appears to be right, it seems to be right, but in the end, it leads to death or leads to destruction. And then we looked over at Psalm 25, where the psalmist said, Lord, show me the right way. Show me the right path. I want to follow that path. I want to follow the path that you would have for me. And so it seems that when we look at Scripture, that there's a way that seems right but leads to the wrong end. And there's this other way that we've got to explore. What is it for us to live this kind of life, to be formed into the image of Christ? And so last week was kind of week one. We took a look at the story that the world tells us. Now that story, some have used the language worldview. That story that the world tells us is about what's real, what's good, what's true. And it shapes how we live life, doesn't it? It shapes how we raise our kids. It shapes how we relate to one another, handle marriage, finances, how we think about sexuality, gender. All of those kinds of things are influenced by this thing that philosophers call worldview. It's a story that humanity has told or experiences, and part of our challenge is that just like you wouldn't ask a fish what is water, number one, because fish can't talk. Nemo can, by the way, so you could talk to Nemo, right? But the reason why is because they swim in these, they're just surrounded by this thing, so they're unaware of the fact that these are the waters that they swim in. And so in the same way, we recognize that we as human beings swim in the water, or we live in a story that the world tells us. Now, last week, we took the time to kind of pull back the curtain and look at the forces that are at work behind those stories. And the forces, if you remember, we said it's the devil, the flesh, and the world. And we use this quote from John Mark Comer in his book, No More Lies, or Live No Lies, which says that deceptive ideas, and you remember, the devil is the father of lies. Like, that's his native language. He's constantly lying and deceiving, and isn't that what we see in the Garden of Eden? When he lies to Adam and Eve about who God is, and can you really trust God? And I'm not so sure that God is good, and they believed the lie. And it says that these deceptive ideas that play to our disordered desires, right? Think in terms of appetites, desires, those things that we hunger after, those things that we yearn for, right? So deceptive ideas that play to our disordered desires that are normalized in a sinful society. And so and we looked at a bunch of scriptures last week to help us understand that there are forces at work behind the story the world in which we live tells us. The devil, our flesh, and the world, where this kind of sinful patterns, when you have 7 billion people or so kind of living their disordered desires, all of those things can be normalized in the world or the culture in which we live. And so we pull back the curtain to try to understand, what is the counterfeit story? What's the fake news that the devil is trying to work into our flesh by getting us to believe lies and normalize in the world in which we live? And so there's a very, well, not a famous, but there's a person who, by the name of Bobette Buster, and which I just think is a fantastic name. Who names their child Bobette Buster? Like, that's just, what should we name? Bobette Buster. Now, I don't know if that's her real name or if that's her screen name. She's actually a professor of storytelling at Northeastern University. Can you believe that? You can actually have a professor of storytelling once upon a time. Every class starts with once upon a time, right? So she's the professor of storytelling, but she's actually hired by Pixar and Disney and Amazon Studios to help these movie-making studios understand the power of story and storytelling. And she makes this statement, what I think is absolutely true. She says, narrative is our culture's currency. He who tells the best story wins. And so the world in which you live, fueled by these forces behind the scenes, is trying to tell you a story, a way of being, a way of living, a way of thinking about meaning and purpose and what is good and what is real and what is true, about God, about meaning or significance, about the future. The world is telling you a story that will affect how you order and live your life. But he who tells the best story wins. And so what I want to do today, and what we're going to do over the next 5 weeks, is we're going to look at different aspects of God's story. Because God tells a story that helps us to understand what is real and what is true, what is good, who is he, what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to have meaning and purpose as a human being, where does all of this go, what is the future, what is destiny, what does purpose look like as a human being. And so God has a story that he tells that doesn't mirror, but that tells the truth about what the purpose is, what the meaning is, the way of life. Now that story gets labeled or gets called, and you may have heard of it, this word gospel. How many of you have heard the word gospel? It's a word that's kind of made a little bit of a resurgence in the last 10 years. You know, like vinyl, vintage clothing. I think even tapes are making a comeback now. My daughter actually has a Walkman that she got when she was in France, because it's like cool to have like this thing on your hip that you put tapes in, right? The word gospel is a word that has experienced a bit of a resurgence over the last 10 years. It's kind of cool in the church world to talk about gospel. Gospel-centered Christianity, gospel-centered children's ministry, gospel this, gospel that. But what is the gospel? And if it's the story that God is telling us about how we get to live life, his version of what life is actually meant to be like, we ought to understand this story that's called the gospel. Now for you and for me, maybe you've been around, kind of not around church world, and so gospel might not be a familiar word, but you may have heard the word, gospel truth. That's gospel truth, right? It's like this idea that what I'm saying has truth to it. It might be that, man, if you've been around a long time, when I say the word gospel, you think of old-timey, kind of gospel revival meetings in a tent, or maybe the Gaithers. Some of you know who the Gaithers are. And some of you don't know who the Gaithers are, and you should probably look up who the Gaithers are, just for fun. But you might think about the Gaithers. But for many Christians in America, when they hear the term gospel, what comes to mind is some sort of story about, I know there's this thing called sin, and that somehow separates me from God, and Jesus comes, he leaves heaven, he lives on earth, and he dies on the cross so that I can be forgiven for sin. In fact, amongst Gen Z, there's kind of a high percentage of people, Christian Gen Zers, that's your high school students, right, who don't even believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And so what happens is that in the church, in America, in the Western world, what we can inadvertently do is reduce the gospel down to a partial story. And by doing so, we miss out on the full extent of what God has invited us into, the story that God is telling. It's a little bit like this. You have your iPhone, right? And I use the iPhone because that's what God would use. God would never use an Android. Okay? God would totally use an iPhone. Okay? But it's like you have your iPhone and the only thing you ever use your iPhone for is making phone calls. How novel an idea. How 1990s of you, right? I mean, a phone that makes phone calls, really? But you realize that this device right here is absolutely amazing. It can help you find directions. It can help you, kind of cash app your friends. It can help you see what's going on in the world. In fact, if you download the all-new ALC app, shameless plug, you can even plug in to know what's going on around Abundant Life Church. How many of you know there's a whole lot more to an iPhone than just making a phone call? Well, in the same way, because of some things that happened in the 19th century in Germany and liberal theologians, what happened was that the gospel got reduced to this kind of narrow story of I've sinned and I need to kind of be forgiven of my sin, and that's what Jesus did, and so someday I will go to heaven. And the problem with that is that it's only part of the story. The other problem with that is that we have tended to reduce that story called the gospel to a point of salvation when I come to just accept Christ for the very first time. And yet, Paul, you have to ask yourself the question, If the gospel is just about my salvation, if the gospel just is that story that helps me understand how I'm going to be forgiven of my sins and somehow get to heaven someday, why is it that Paul constantly in his writings is preaching the gospel, writing to Christians about the gospel? Why does he keep coming to church and saying, I'm going to preach the gospel to you one more time? In fact, you see it, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, 1-5, which is probably one of the best descriptions of the gospel, I think, in the letters of Paul. The whole letter of Galatians is saying, you started out so well by believing the gospel. Why have you so quickly departed from that which helped you get started? In other words, get back to the gospel. And then look what he says in Romans chapter 1. By the way, we are going to be in Romans chapter 1, in the book of Romans a lot today, okay? So if you've got your Bibles, I encourage you to open those to the book of Romans. But look what he says in Romans chapter 1, verse 13-15. He says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters. Who's he writing to? He's writing to the church, isn't he? He's writing to brothers and sisters, those who have received Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, those who have been rescued, who have been saved, who have been rescued by Jesus. And he says this, don't want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you, as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. Verse 14, I am under obligation, both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. And what you read, if you read through the letters of Paul in the New Testament, Paul is constantly preaching the gospel to the church. In fact, Corinthians, which is the letter that he wrote, or 1 Corinthians, the letter that he wrote after his time at Mars Hill in the book of Acts. Mars Hill was this kind of least fruitful time of of Paul's ministry, because he was reasoning and arguing and debating the culture of the day, and he had so little fruit. And he then writes this letter to the Corinthian church, and he says, you know what? I'm going to know nothing but Christ and Christ crucified amongst you. I am going to preach the gospel now until the day that Jesus takes me home. The gospel became central. The gospel became foundational. The gospel became everything to Paul around Christianity. And so we have to recognize that it's so easy for us to hear this word gospel and go, yeah, I get it. And Paul would say, no, you don't. I want to help you understand what the gospel is, the story of God that defines meaning and purpose, who God is, who we are as human beings, what the future would look like. What does it mean to have meaning and purpose as a human being? This is the gospel. In fact, J.D. Greer says it this way in his book, simply called The Gospel. He says this, he says, the gospel is not the diving board off of which we jump into the pool of Christianity. It's the pool itself. It's not only the way we begin in Christ, it is the way we grow in Christ. The gospel isn't just the ABC of Christianity. The gospel is the A through Z of Christianity. And about, maybe 15 years ago, I was raking leaves. And maybe you've heard me share this story, but I'm raking leaves in my backyard. Now remember, I've gone to Bible college. I'm a pastor at a church. I've been a pastor at a church for some 15 years. And so here I am one Friday afternoon raking leaves in upstate New York. Now, just so that you feel sorry for me, I had 150 bags of leaves that I had to pick up every fall. Because if I didn't get those in, they were going to just crucify my lawn, okay? So now you can feel sorry for me, okay? But I'm raking these leaves, I have my little headphones in, and in the midst of just raking leaves and listening to some worship music, it's almost like the Lord just showed up, and he awakens me to the gospel. And it's like in that moment, I realized, here I am, a Christian and a pastor and a leader, and I graduated from Bible college, and for 20 years, I've been walking around post-Bible college with armfuls of morals, armfuls of principles, trying to figure out how to stitch it all together, not fully understanding or recognizing the full extent of the gospel. And so if I, a pastor, a graduate of Portland Bible College, needed to be awakened to the gospel and the full extent of what the gospel is, I think this is what Paul is trying to do in his writings. He's trying to help believers be awakened to the full extent of the gospel and not reduce it to a partial story. In fact, look what he says in Romans chapter 1, 16-17. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Verse 17, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Do you see what Paul's writing in this letter? Like in these two verses, Paul is saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's foolishness to man, but it's the wisdom of God. And I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why? Because it's the power of God unto salvation, right? Now that word there and the way that was written there is not just that it's the power of God unto salvation, like the start of my journey. The gospel is the power of God unto my ongoing journey of salvation. And he reinforces it when he says this. He says that the righteousness of God is revealed what? From faith to faith. Paul's trying to help the readers in Rome understand that you never outrun the gospel, that you never outrun your need and your dependence on the gospel. And so it's important for us to understand, well then, what is the gospel? If I could say it this way, I think the gospel is God's story about himself, what's real, what's good, what's true, what does it mean to be human, where do we find meaning, and where is creation heading? The gospel is not limited to your salvation. The gospel isn't limited to kind of a right understanding of what Jesus did so that I can get into heaven. The gospel is God's story to help you and I understand what he is up to, who he is, the purpose that he had for you and I as human beings and all of creation. Where does all of this go? Now that's hard for us because oftentimes when we pick up this book and we start to read it, we can look at this book, it can get confusing because there's 66 different books within this one book, and it's broken up into an Old Testament and a New Testament. It seems that God used 35 different authors to help write this book. So he spoke or he inspired them and they write this book. And so we recognize, man, when you pick up the book, it's like, man, I look at it and it's just confusing. Because there's all these different authors and different styles of writing and different stories. And so what we can sometimes do is reduce this book to some sort of a guidebook. Any of you ever woken up and said, Lord, I really need you to speak to me this morning? Nope, that's not, let's try another one, Lord. And what we can do is we can be confused by the book, or we can reduce the book to something that it's not. And what I'm trying to help us understand, and what I think Paul is writing and what it gets communicated through the gospel, is that this book is one story. This book has one hero in that story. And can I be honest with you? It's not you. You're not the center of this book. God is the center of this book. But oftentimes we read this book and we make it about us, don't we? Like, let's just use this as an illustration. We're gonna talk about David and Goliath. Maybe you've heard this preached in church somewhere, you know? And so who are the characters and who do you represent or identify with in the story? Well, obviously, I am David in the story, and Goliath is my biggest enemy. And so if you're like if I was like one of those kinds of preachers, I'd say, man, you gotta bring 5 stones, you gotta go after prayer, you gotta go after worship, you gotta go after giving. We always gotta talk about giving, right? You gotta fast, you gotta do these things so that you can overcome your greatest enemy. We make ourselves the center of the story. And actually what the Bible would want us to understand is that actually Jesus is represented by David in this story. Goliath is your biggest enemy, which is, by the way, sin and death. And you know who you are in the story? You're Israel, cowering in a corner because of the enemy that's overcoming you. And what the book is about a hero who comes to rescue us, but not just rescue us, but to set things right. This is the gospel. And it's not you at the center of the story. In fact, how does the whole story start? In the beginning, you. Is that what it says? No, it says in the beginning. That ought to clue us in as to who this thing's about, who the story's about, shouldn't it? Like, this whole thing isn't about you and me. This whole thing is about God, his purpose, what he's up to, what his whole design was when he created this whole thing called creation. That we got to understand who is God. Now, excuse me, I gotta move through this, otherwise I'll keep you here till 1 o'clock today. It's okay. I got permission from one person, so it's not my fault now. Whoever said that's okay, it's their fault, right? But let me break this down for us. This story called the gospel is broken down into, it's almost like 4 movements or 4 segments of a movie. If you were to think about it as a movie, there's 4 segments or movements or chapters of this story that the Bible tells us. Now, I'm only gonna cover 3 of them today, and we're gonna cover the 4th movement or the 4th chapter in the last week of the series. How many of you like that tease? That means you gotta lean in, like if you're missing a week, you gotta download the app and you gotta listen to the sermon, right? Like, shameless plug for the new app. Okay, but there's 4 movements, and I'm gonna cover the first 3 today. And the first movement is what we're calling the original purpose. Some call it creation. That when God created, right, and we've already established the fact that it's God, in the beginning, God begins to reveal a story. God begins, and in revealing this story, the first thing he does is he reveals who he is. So God, who is self-existent and eternal, and I know that's hard for us to, as finite human beings, to wrap our mind around, but God, who has no beginning and has no end, God who is eternal, God who is all powerful, God who has all authority, God creates something. And in creating something, he's revealing who he is. In fact, what we see in the creation story is God reveals his power, right? I mean, he makes something out of nothing. How many of you know somebody that can make something out of nothing? You know what? Don't answer that question, right? Some people just seem to make something out of nothing. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about God. Like, God literally speaks and worlds get created, sun, moon, and stars get created, planets get created, the sea gets created. Like, he just speaks, and where there was nothing, something's getting formed and created. And so what we see revealed about God in this story of creation is we see God's power. We also see God's wisdom. We talked about this in the Friendology series, that God is a God of order. He separates the night from the day. He separates the land from the seas. Like, this creation story is telling us something about who God is, and God is powerful, and God is wise. He orders things, right? But the third thing that we see in creation is we see his glory being revealed. In fact, Psalm 19, verse 1 says, the heavens declare the glory of the Lord, the skies above proclaim his handiwork. And in creation, we see the glory of the Lord being created. In fact, God creates all of creation, including humanity, for his glory and our good. He turns to Adam and Eve, having created them and all of creation. And what does he tell them? He says, I want to bless you. I want you to be fruitful. I want you to multiply. I want you to take what is being established by me on this earth, and I want you to expand it to the ends of the earth. And it was to delight in, to enjoy, and all of it was rolling up in praise and adoration and glory to God. Humanity, you and I, all of creation was created for God's glory. And he's revealing himself in this first movement or first chapter of the story. Now, I told you we were going to be in Romans quite a bit. Look what Paul said in Romans chapter 19, verse 20. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his internal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. And so we have a counterfeit story that's trying to say God isn't real. And what Paul is saying in Romans is that what you read about in the account in Genesis, the creation account in Genesis, is God revealing himself to you and to me and to all of creation. And it leaves us without excuse. So God reveals who he is. He reveals his purpose, his power, and why he's created humanity in this perfect relationship with him is for his glory and for our good. He leaves his fingerprints everywhere. In fact, philosophers have grouped these fingerprints into 4 categories. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but just so that you understand, they define the first one as the cosmological fingerprint of God. Meaning, if you were to go to the Sistine Chapel, or if you were to go to the Taj Mahal in India, you don't go and look up at the ceiling and the majestic paintings that are on the ceiling and go, obviously there was a fortuitous accident that happened and all of this just happened. What you recognize is that there's design, there's an intelligence behind the thing that you're seeing created. Well, the same is true of creation. And so it's the first fingerprint of God, right? Second one is the moral fingerprint of God, that inside every human being is we have this category where we define what is right and what is wrong. Every single human being has some measure of good and evil, what is right and what is wrong. Now that might differ in the world in which we live because of redefinition of good and evil and all of those kinds of things. But you have to ask yourself the question, where did that come from? That every single human being created, every single human being born on this planet has some sort of sense about right and wrong? Could I suggest to you that being created in the image of God, we reflect a sense of knowing what is right and what is wrong? And wasn't that the flashpoint in the garden? That it was God who defined who was right and wrong. It was Adam and Eve believing the deception of the enemy that chose to redefine what was good and evil. So it's the moral fingerprint. The third one is the desire fingerprint, that we yearn for things beyond the material world. Like it's not just eat as much, buy as many toys as possible, and then just die, right? Otherwise you would see U-Haul trucks following hearses at funerals. Like there's something inside of us that desires and yearns for love and for significance and for meaning. Like, do we matter or not? And C.S. Lewis would say it this way. He said, man, if you have those desires within you that can't be fulfilled in a material world, it's possible that then those desires can only be fulfilled outside of the material world, that there's something beyond the here and now. It's the desire fingerprint. But the last one is the teleological fingerprint. And telos literally means, or it means purpose. And the idea is that there appears to be purpose for this cosmos, for this ball of earth that we live on. And that purpose seems to involve humanity. Now, listen to what scientists say, not theologians, scientists. Listen to what they say. If oxygen levels in the atmosphere dropped by 6%, we'd suffocate and die. If they rose by 4%, our planet would erupt into a giant fireball. If carbon dioxide levels rose 0.5%, our world would become an oven. And if they dropped by just 0.02%, there would be no atmosphere at all. If we were 2% closer to the sun, we would be too hot for water to exist. And if our planet wasn't tilted at 23.5 degrees, temperature would be far more extreme. If Jupiter wasn't the size that it is, in the place that it is, the world would experience 10,000 times the number of asteroids hitting our atmosphere as we currently do. Scientists refer to this as the Goldilocks principle. Our universe is just right for us to survive. Someone created it on purpose and for a purpose. What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Now, Paul says it in Romans chapter 11, verse 36, for from him and through him and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever and ever. And so in this first movement, this first chapter, what we see is that God reveals who he is, and he reveals the purpose for which he has created all of creation and you and I as human beings. And Paul clearly identifies it. It's for him, it's through him, and to all things belong to him. Like, it's for his glory. That you and I and the world in which we live were created for the glory of God. But as Matt Chandler says, we are allergic to the idea that everything exists, including us, not for ourselves, but for the glory of God. And what we have a tendency to do is that we want to place ourselves at the center of existence. And this is what happens in movement number 2, or chapter number 2 of this story that God's revealing called the gospel. And you know the story because Genesis 1, everything's going well. Genesis 2 is further kind of description of all that's happening. And by the time you get to chapter 3 of Genesis, you know the story. The serpent deceives Eve and Adam and questions, does a character assassination on God. I'm not sure that you can really trust God. I'm not sure that God really is out for your good and for your best. You should probably take control of that yourself. And there's this interesting verse that we see in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 13. God speaking to Adam and Eve, or speaking to the woman, says this, "What is this that you have done?" And what God is speaking to in that moment isn't the fact that she took a bite from an apple that she shouldn't have taken. Can you feel the urgency? Can you feel there is something of a greater magnitude that has been unleashed into the world because of the actions of Adam and Eve, and not just Adam and Eve, but in the heart of all of humanity? Something has been unleashed. What is this? What is this, Eve, that you have done? See, God creates all, and all that he creates is good and perfect, and it's to be delighted in, and it's to be enjoyed. It's as you trust God and delight in him and enjoy what's going on, that all of it rolls up into glory, and God can see what's coming. He can see the whole way down. Like, what I have created is going to extend the kingdom of God on this earth. But the enemy comes with a deceptive idea, and he deceives Adam and Eve, and he, God, can now see what's going to take place. That what has been unleashed in the earth, what has been unleashed into every human heart, what has been unleashed into humanity is, and you know what I'm going to say, a little three-letter word called sin. Paul said it this way in Romans chapter 1, "For though they knew God, they did not honor God or honor him as God or give him thanks or give thanks to him." And what we recognize is that sin in chapter 2 of this gospel story is unleashed into not just the human heart, but into all creation. Deceptive ideas, partnering with our disordered desires that are normalized in a sinful culture. And so this sin gets unleashed on the planet. Now, the problem is that when we start talking about sin, there's all of these definitions of sin. It's like moralism. I kind of did something I shouldn't have done. It's like a little white lie, or it's, kind of, I should have done that, or I shouldn't have thought that way. I shouldn't have talked that way. I shouldn't have looked at that. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have done that. And what we do is we kind of reduce sin down to kind of something that we can manage and handle. Could I say it this way? We almost sanitize sin and don't realize the full effect of sin on the human heart and all of creation. But God did. And it's why God said to Eve, "What is this that you have done? You have unleashed something on the planet that is going to try now to subvert my purpose, my plan, my story for you as a human being and for all of creation." If I could say this, what's the middle letter in the word sin? I. And therein lies the problem. I'll give you a definition for sin. Sin is, and I'm going to say, the displacement of God at the center. Sin is the displacement of God at the center. That's exactly what happened in Genesis, and that's exactly what happens in our hearts over and over and over again. We want to put ourselves on the throne. We want to put ourselves at the center. In 1543, a guy by the name of Nicholas Copernicus, he was an astrologer, and up until that point, everybody believed that the planets revolved around the earth. I mean, why wouldn't you believe that? Like every morning I see the sun, and every night I see the moon and the stars. Like they're going around us. But what Copernicus discovered is that the only planet in the solar system that had the gravitational power to hold all of the other planets in their orbit was the sun. And he began to realize that, wait, the sun is actually the center of the universe, not the earth. Well, we do the same thing. If the Earth was at the center of the solar planet, all of the other planets would begin to spin out of orbit because the Earth doesn't have the gravitational power to hold everything in order. Remember, I said God is powerful, God is a God of order, and God reveals his glory. God set the sun as an example to us at the center of the solar system because God is the only one who has the power to hold everything else in creation in order. But what we keep wanting to do is put ourselves at the center. That's what Adam and Eve did, and that's what every human being since that point forward has done, put themselves at the center of the universe. Now, the problem with that is that when we do that, and when 7 billion people do that, the world in which we live begins to spin out of orbit. And we do things like we take God's creation and we destroy it with our excess and with our just disregard. And you can take a look at some of the pictures I'm putting on the screen. With all of our wealth, we still deal with homelessness and addiction, not just in the world that we live in, the city that we live in. 50% of Americans are considered obese. In fact, we produce twice as much food as we can possibly consume on an annual basis, and yet we still deal with famine all over the world. We've seen it this last few days, another war. In Afghanistan, there was an earthquake and 2,000 people, and then even in our own country, we see kids being shot in schools and the impact that that has on family and the fear that that begins to create amongst parents who now have to parent kids who've experienced that kind of thing. The point that I'm wanting us to understand this morning, and I know this is heavy, but because we have chosen to put ourselves at the center, that's what sin is, and because 7 billion people now on our planet have chosen to put themselves at the center, the world in which we live begins to spin out of orbit. And so the question, and Paul actually addresses the question this way because he's talking about now this disease that's infected the human heart and infected all of creation, and we see it. And Paul says this, he says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." And so this disease, this thing that got released into the heart of humanity and all of creation, right, that God talked about in Genesis chapter 3, it says that in Romans chapter 6:23, it says that the wages of that sin, that disease that we now allow and buy into by trying to keep ourselves at the center versus putting God at the center, it says the wages of that sin is death. Didn't we talk about this last week? What is the goal of the enemy? To steal, to kill, and to destroy. And because we chose to believe a deceptive idea, because we choose to believe the deceptive idea over and over and over again, and it intersects with our disordered desires, you know what? I'm at the center. Gareth at the center of it all. Come on. It just doesn't have the same ring, does it? And can you imagine the chaos in this room if we all decided to put our own name in that space? And the disharmony and the disunity and the dysfunction that it would create, that's exactly what sin has done in creation. And so we have this problem now. We have this thing, this curse that's come across upon the creation, this death, this separation from God, who was supposed to be at the center, who holds all things together for his glory and our good. And because we've allowed this to happen, because we continue to perpetrate this, we have a problem. And the question is, how do we fix the problem? How do we reverse the curse? Well, the problem for us is that we try to do it ourselves, don't we? In fact, what we try is religion. And religion is this idea that if I just obey, then God will accept me. And what, even in my own life, like I know that Jesus accepts me. I know that Jesus loves me. And this is what Paul's talking about in the Galatians. And this is why it's so important for us as followers and disciples of Jesus Christ that we never outrun the gospel and kind of imagine or grow out of our need for the gospel. Because what happens is we keep trying to fill that space. Well, if I just obey and I just do enough good things, then I will be acceptable to God. Then perhaps my world will begin to spin right. But Paul, once again in Romans chapter 3, says this: no one will be justified, that is declared right in his sight by the works of the law. In other words, all of our righteousness or all of our self-righteousness, all of our religion doesn't help us get right with God. It says only the knowledge of sin comes through the law. And isn't that true? Because no matter how hard you try to do good things, and I'm just going to try and earn God's favor by trying to obey him, it can last a day, it could last a week, it could last a season, but you know that, man, I just failed one more time. And it might not be in the area that you've been struggling in, but it's in some other area where, man, I just can't outrun this thing in my own strength. And the reason why is because you can't heal yourself. You can't deliver yourself. Someone needs to do that in your place. And that moves us into the third chapter, the third movement. Paul said it this way in Romans chapter 3, 21, 24. He says, but now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. So something that Jesus did, Jesus who leaves the splendor and majesty of heaven, who is the Son of God, who lives the life I will never live, would never live, can never live, right? He lives a sinless life and he willingly goes to the cross in my place. What does all of that mean? And what Paul is saying here is that we are, and look, there's two phrases I want to just explore. Justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. You've heard the phrase, commit the crime, do the time, right? What you gonna do when they come for you, bad boys, bad boys. Okay, sorry, I'm singing a lot today. Commit the crime, do the time, right? And it's, what is that? What fuels that? Well, what is inside every human being is a desire for justice, for things that are wrong to be put right. Like if somebody breaks into your house and ransacks your house, or if somebody steals your car, right? Or if somebody kind of steals money or a phone, maybe you're in school. When my kids moved back here to Clackamas, they had a rude awakening. They went to Clackamas High School and they had phones stolen and money stolen, you know, all kinds of crazy stuff. And what happens when those things happen inside the heart of every human being is that we want justice and we want it now. But the problem arises and we begin to change the definition of justice when we're the one committing the crime. So you have to ask yourself the question, where does that sense of justice come from? It comes from the fact that you and I are created in the image of God. And there's this desire for things to be put right, things that were wrong. There needs to be justice. Those things need to be put right. I need to get back the car that was stolen. I need it to be fixed, and the person that stole it needs to do the time because they committed the crime. Well, that justice comes from the heart of God. God is a God of justice. And you don't want a God who is unjust. You want a God who is just. You want a God who looks at the world and says, man, what is wrong needs to be put right, because that's what you desire in every other arena where you want justice. But the problem arises, we are the perpetrators of the crime. We're the ones who ransacked God's creation. We're the ones who said, no longer do you get to sit on the throne, I'm going to sit on the throne and I'm going to do a better job of ruling my little world than you do. And it's in that case that we don't want, well, I'm not so sure that I agree with justice anymore. But God's a God of justice. And not only is God just, the Bible teaches us that God is holy and God's holiness impacts his justice. Like he is perfect in every way. And for God not to deal with the injustice of our sin upon all creation would mean God would not be God. And so God, who is holy, must serve justice on those who have committed the crime. Now, because of Jesus, that justice isn't served on you and I. That justice is served on Jesus, the only one who had never sinned. And he goes willingly to the cross. And it says that Jesus takes our sin and Jesus imputes his righteousness. In fact, this verse says it this way. It says that you are justified freely. meaning that you are declared righteous. Not because of your efforts, not because of all the good things that you have done, not because tomorrow I'm going to get up and surrender one more time to Jesus. Tomorrow I'm going to get up and still struggle with sin, but what I'm doing is surrendering my life afresh and anew, once again to Jesus. I stand in Jesus' righteousness. The Father sees me not through my own efforts or my own ability. The Father sees me through the Son, Jesus, and declares me to be righteous, just as if I never sinned. Justified. I was in New York. I know you won't believe this, but I ran a stop sign. Your pastor ran a stop sign, and I got pulled over by the cops, and I got given a ticket, and I felt like the biggest criminal on the planet. And I went to Clifton Park Town Court at my assigned time, and justified is this idea that, man, I'm standing before the judge, and at some point, a jury foreman, or in this case, the judge, is going to stand up and he's going to declare a verdict. And so here I am with my ticket in hand, having run a stop sign and been pulled over by the cops. I mean, I may as well have been the worst criminal. That's how I felt anyway. And I'm like, man, they're going to throw the book at me. And I'm like sitting thinking, what can I say to the judge that he might have mercy on me? And the judge sits there, and I looked up, and I'm like, oh, I know that guy. His son is in Scouts with my son. And he looks at me, and he says, you're free to go. But I committed the crime. Don't I have to do the time? He says, nope. Just as if it never happened, you're justified. Now, you know what I did after that, don't you? Every stop sign I came to, I just blew right through it because, man, I've been forgiven. Just gotta keep driving through those stop signs. That's not at all what I did, is it? See, that's the difference between religion and the gospel. Religion says, I gotta obey and maybe God will accept me. No, because you are accepted, I obey. Because you are accepted, I have a responsive allegiance to a new king, the King of Kings. He takes the throne. He takes the place of honor. He takes the center of my life. And I want to live my life now. Almost ripped the pocket off my shirt. I want to live my life now with him at the center. See, that's what the gospel does. And this is why Paul says, I want to preach the gospel to you, because the devil's going to keep coming to you. Your own flesh is going to keep coming to you and say, you got to fix this on your own. You got to do this on your own strength. You got to get there by your own might. No, you cannot do it. Jesus has done it. And you and I need to be reminded on a daily basis that I live from this place of being forgiven, being justified, being redeemed by Jesus Christ. And he gives me the freedom, he gives me the power to now live as a son and as a daughter, as a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. And it is my delight and my joy. Because why? You've been redeemed. It's an ancient banking term. You have been purchased back, not just purchased back to be forgiven and survive and struggle your way through life. You have been purchased back to original purpose. To delight in him, to give him the place of honor in your life, to give him the place that is the throne. Now here's the problem, and I'm landing the plane. Here's the problem. We keep wanting to crawl off the altar and back onto the throne every day. It's the battle, the enmity that Paul talked about, the war that rages within you. Is I'm gonna crawl off the altar, I deserve to be on the throne. And the Bible, the gospel, the story that we live out of says, no. I present myself as a living sacrifice. He is the king who takes the place of honor. He's at the center of my existence. And I'm telling you, if you will choose to believe the gospel, the story that God tells us in his word, if you will choose to live that way, what will happen in your world, what will happen in your life is that which is in chaos will begin to get into order, because God is the only one that can sustain or has the gravitational power to hold everything in your life in order. And the more and more of us who choose to live that way will see a community begin to be impacted by people who are choosing to place Jesus at the center, and he holds all things together for his good, for our good and his glory. And what we'll begin to see is communities beginning to find their right orbit. That we would be a community here where we're choosing to say, God, you're at the center of our lives. And as we choose to give you that place, not just today because I'm in church, but tomorrow morning and the next day and the next week and the next month and the next season, if I will give myself to that, the good news of the gospel, my life will begin to orbit. My life will begin to have order instead of chaos. We just don't have the power and the ability to do it ourselves.